The first strike came so fast he did not have time to react. A fist, heavy, calloused, smashed into his cheek, snapping his head sideways. His breath caught. For a moment, the world blurred, colors bleeding together under the streetlights. The taste of metal swelled in his mouth. "Face down! Now!" The voice was raw, commanding. He did not move fast enough. A boot drove into his ribs. He collapsed onto the pavement, palms scraping against the rough asphalt. The heat of the ground burned through his suit. Sirens howled in the distance. Another hand, this one tighter, angrier, wrenched his arm back, pressing his wrist into the small of his back. The pressure was unbearable. His fingers twitched, reaching for something, anything, to brace against. His heart pounded against the concrete. This was not happening. Not like this. Not to him. "License and registration, huh?" The officer's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You decided to act cute, and now look where we are." He could barely process the words. His mind was still spinning from the hit. He struggled to breathe, to form a thought beyond the searing pain in his ribs. The weight of the officer's knee dug into his back, pressing the air from his lungs. "Please!" His voice cracked. "Shut up." Another yank, another bolt of pain. Flashing lights bathed the street in harsh red and blue. The sound of car doors slamming. Murmurs of voices, distant but closing in. His vision swam, but he could make out silhouettes. More officers stepping out, hands on their holsters, faces unreadable in the artificial glow. He felt hands patting him down, rough, invasive. The man searched for something, an excuse, a reason, a gun, a weapon, anything. "You think you're above the law, huh?" the cop muttered. His breath was close, hot against his ear. His mind screamed, but his body refused to fight back. He knew better. He had spent years knowing better. He had sat in rooms where people in pressed suits debated policies, laws, and the illusion of justice. Yet here he was, face to the ground, knees scraping against broken asphalt. Blood. No, he caught himself. He could not even think the word. Crowd was gathering now. He could hear footsteps slowing, hushed voices whispering. He wanted to turn his head, to see the faces watching this unfold, but the weight on his spine kept him in place. Then a voice, sharp, cutting through the static. "What the hell are you doing?" The pressure lifted. The hands that had gripped him so tightly just moments ago suddenly loosened. The murmurs in the background swelled. Something shifted. A pause, a hesitation, a realization. His body was still pressed against the pavement, his chest rising and falling in jagged gasps. But something had changed. The officer's voice, once thick, with authority, wavered. He refused to comply. You just assaulted a diplomat." Silence. The word hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. The night itself seemed to contract around it. The officer stepped back so quickly it was almost comical. The weight of his knee, his hands, his presence, gone. A new figure appeared above him, one that did not belong to the officer who had knocked him to the ground. A suit, dark, pressed, professional. "Sir, are you all right?" He let out a slow, shaking breath. The taste of iron still lingered on his tongue. His wrist throbbed where it had been twisted behind his back. His ribs ached, but the real pain, the one that cut the deepest, was not physical. It was in the way they looked at him now. Not as a threat, not as a nameless man on the street, but as a mistake. a costly one. The officer who had hit him, the one who had shoved him to the ground, who had pressed his knee into his back, stood frozen. His mouth opened, closed. He was searching for something, a way to backpedal, to justify, to erase the last 5 minutes from existence. But there was nothing to erase. The street had already swallowed it whole. The crowd had already seen. He pushed himself up slowly, wincing as his body protested. The man in the suit reached for him, offering a hand. He ignored it. He did not need their help now. He locked eyes with the officer, and, for the first time, the cop looked afraid. He straightened his suit. His fingers trembled, but he forced them to remain steady. The raw ache in his ribs pulsed with every breath, but he refused to show it. He would not give them the satisfaction. The officer, his attacker, was still standing there, face pale under the flickering streetlights. The arrogance that had filled his voice moments ago was gone. Now his eyes darted, searching for an escape. "Sir," the suited man beside him spoke again, softer this time. "We need to get you checked by a doctor." He barely heard him. His focus was locked on the officer. "You assaulted me." The words were not loud, but they cut through the night like glass shattering on marble. The officer's jaw tightened. You weren't compliant." He almost laughed. Almost. But there was nothing funny about it. "I asked why I was being stopped," he said, voice even. "And for that, you put me on the ground?" A muscle twitched in the officer's cheek. It wasn't personal. Not personal." The words pressed into his chest like another blow. His mind played back the past 10 minutes. The way the officer's voice had shifted when he had first rolled down his window. The immediate tension. The way the man's hand had hovered near his holster before he even had a reason. Not personal. It was always personal. A new set of flashing lights flooded the street. A different kind of vehicle. Black. Sleek. Not a patrol car. Higher-ups had arrived. The suited man who had intervened stepped forward, his tone sharpening. "Sergeant Mills," he addressed the officer directly. "You are to wait in your vehicle until Internal Affairs arrives." Mills. The name barely mattered. The officer hesitated. His grip tightened around his belt as if grounding himself. "I was just doing my job." The man in the suit did not reply. Instead, he turned to him. "We should go." For a moment, he considered it. Leaving. Letting this moment dissolve into the night. Pretending it was another ugly but distant memory. But then he saw the crowd. People still lingering at the edges of the scene. Their faces were a mix of shock, anger, and something else. Something unspoken. Recognition. He wasn't the first. Would not be the last. A deep breath. No. He lifted his chin. He assaulted me in public. He should answer for it in public. A shift. The air grew heavier. The suited man, his colleague, a liaison from the consulate, exchanged glances with another official who had just arrived. There was tension in their silence. This was not how these things were handled. They wanted it quiet, controlled, filed away under misunderstanding. But he had spent years watching things get buried. His voice, calm but unyielding, broke the silence. "Call the press." The officers stiffened, even the ones who had just arrived. The weight of the words settled over the night like a storm cloud. Mills' face drained of color. "Sir, please." The desperation in his voice was almost poetic. A moment ago, He was just another faceless man, another body pinned to the pavement. Now he was something else, someone that could cost them. Why? He tilted, his head studying the officer. Why should I let this disappear? Mills swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. There was no answer. Because the truth was, there was no justification. Not for this. He turned to the official beside him, the one who had tried to usher him away. Did they run my plates? A pause. Then a reluctant nod. Yes. He already knew what that meant. They had his name long before they put him on the ground. They had seen who he was. And they had done it anyway. Because before his title, before his position, they saw his skin. And that was enough. The weight of the moment settled. The crowd was watching. The officers were waiting. And for the first time tonight, he was in control. He exhaled, slow and steady. Then he reached into his pocket, deliberately, carefully, pulled out his phone, and made the call himself. This would not disappear, and neither would he. The video spread before the news crews even arrived. Someone in the crowd had recorded it, shaky, raw, undeniable. The moment the officer struck him, the force used, the words said, the way the man only realized his mistake after checking his credentials. By the time the official statement came from the department, the narrative was already out of their hands. Diplomat assaulted in traffic stop. Officer uses excessive force before realizing victim's identity. Another misunderstanding, or a pattern? The headlines wrote themselves. But he knew how these things worked. He had seen it before. The news cycle would run hot for a few days. Outrage would swell. And then, silence. The world would move on, unless he did something about it. He sat in a sterile conference room, across from a senior police official. A press conference had been scheduled. Not for justice, not for accountability, for damage control. They wanted him to smooth it over, to say it was unfortunate, but isolated, a bad officer, not a broken system. He let them talk, listened as they spun their version of events. Then, when they finished, he leaned forward and placed his phone on the table. I will not be saying this was a misunderstanding, he said, voice steady. The room stiffened. I will not be saying I believe this was an accident. He met the official's gaze. And I will not be telling the public that this is resolved. The official, a seasoned bureaucrat, exhaled sharply. You are a diplomat, Mr. Adeyemi. That means you understand the importance of diplomacy. He almost laughed. Diplomacy. A word used to silence the ones who had every right to be angry. I understand a great deal, he said. I understand that if I weren't who I am, I might not have walked away from that traffic stop. Silence. The words were too sharp, too real. They forced the official to confront what they already knew. Then, what do you want? The official's voice was clipped. Frustrated. You want the officer fired? He's already on administrative leave pending an investigation. He studied the man across from him. They wanted him to ask for something small. A firing. A punishment. A single man thrown to the wolves so the system could continue untouched. He leaned back in his chair. No, he said. I want change. The official scoffed. That's vague. Not at all. He slid a folder across the table. Reforms. Independent reviews of all excessive force complaints. Bias training that actually has consequences. A new oversight committee that isn't run by officers protecting their own. The official barely glanced at the documents. You think one incident justifies all this? He felt something inside him snap. One incident. He thought about the people who had messaged him since the video went viral. People who had been stopped, brutalized, but had no title, no diplomatic immunity to shield them. One incident? It was every incident that came before him. Every person who had not been believed. Every name that had been forgotten. "You think I am the first," he said quietly. The official shifted, looked away. Then he stood. "You should reconsider your approach, Mr. Adeyemi. You're in a position to bring resolution, not conflict." Resolution. That was their word for silence. Watched the man leave, but he was not discouraged, because outside this room, the world was still watching. The video was still playing. The truth was still out there. And for once, just once, they could not bury it. A month later, the department announced a new oversight initiative. 6 months later, a police review board, independent from the force, was implemented. The officer, Mills, was dismissed. But it was never about him. This had never been about one man. This was about every time before. He knew the system was slow. That change was fought for, not given. But this time, they had no choice. Because, this time, the world refused to forget.